What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, bringing you another MMA edition of the show. As you can see in the video, you got the red and black logo, which represents MMA. The blue and red, of course, represents all things Buffalo Bills. Very excited to dive into this very interesting, intricate matchup between Max Blessed Halloway and Dustin the Diamond Poirier, who are slated to fight each other this weekend, this Saturday night, and it kind of snuck up on us. Originally, when hearing this announcement a few months back, I thought, wow, that fight's in April. And here we are. It's April. It's UFC 236 time, and in a couple weeks from now, it'll be NFL draft time, 2019 NFL draft time. And I'll be sure to keep you guys as up to date as possible on all things NFL draft and on all things UFC and or MMA. A lot of really awesome storylines heading into this night of fights. Max Halloway, the current reigning, defending, undisputed UFC featherweight champion, the champion of the 145-pound weight class, takes on Dustin the Diamond Poirier at 155 pounds for the interim UFC lightweight title. And I get it, fight fans. I get where you're at. I'm right there with you. I hate interim title fights. I'm not a fan of interim title fights. Interim title fights are annoying. They are a pet peeve of mine. They are fights that I think, well, what the hell do we need that for? But in these two instances at UFC 236, Halloway versus Poirier, as well as Gastelum versus Adesanya, you really have reason to believe that these interim title fights are very well needed. These are much needed title fights. These are interim title fights that actually make sense. Both champions of those weight classes, lightweight and middleweight respectively, are out. For whatever reasons, they are out of the picture. Khabib Nurmagomedov is suspended and likely won't be fighting until November or December. And Robert Whittaker has really met the Grim Reaper. Oddly enough, his nickname, The Reaper. Robert Whittaker has met the Grim Reaper a few times or so with these injuries that he has had. Obviously, the Grim Reaper is the thing of death or whatever, but, you know, this guy, basically what I'm saying is he's been touched with some bad luck, and Whittaker will be back at some point, hopefully later this year too. But the winner of both fights, according to Dana White, the UFC president, the winner of both of these fights, whether it's Poirier or Halloway or Gastelum or Adesanya, the winner of both of these fights are fighting the lineal champion. They will have the opportunity to unite or unify the titles, which I like that. There's no point in having an interim title fight if you're not going to have the champ fight the challenger. And in a way, I do believe Dana White when he says that in regards to the middleweight division. I do believe that he will put the winner of Gastelum and Adesanya up against Robert Whittaker. But with the lightweight title, safe to say I'm not so sure. Can we throw that out there? I'm not so sure that Dana will put the winner of Halloway or Poirier up against Khabib Nurmagomedov. And the reason why is due to the fact there's one guy that's kind of standing in their way. That is Conor McGregor, the notorious one. Depending on the length of suspension, we know that stuff, but depending on how the timing works out, I think the UFC is going to push to do Khabib versus Conor immediately. It's a massive, massive fight. It's the biggest fight in the sport. I don't think you could turn that down. As a businessman, I don't think Dana White is that dumb of a businessman, or else he wouldn't be where he is today. I think if you have any sense, though, the long-term quote-unquote play would be to have Khabib Nurmagomedov fight any other fighter in his next title defense but Conor McGregor. Because if Khabib fights Conor again and beats him again, what direction do you have to go in? But Conor doesn't really want to fight anybody else but Khabib. So it's a very interesting situation at hand here that I think the UFC has to really figure out. the longer they delay the inevitable of what I think will eventually happen would be Khabib versus Conor, the worse it's going to get for the remaining fighters in this division, namely Max Holloway and Dustin Poirier. I don't think you make this interim title fight if you don't plan on having Holloway fight Khabib. And that was a fight that was originally scheduled, and I don't think you make this interim title fight if you don't have Poirier possibly fight Khabib. I think Dustin Poirier right now, in terms of number one contendership, I would put him right at the top of the list at that lightweight division, above Conor, above Tony Ferguson, above Justin Gaethje. Really, I think Dustin Poirier was the next man up for the title shot, but due to the fact that Khabib and Conor did what they did after they fought, and Khabib got suspended, it was almost bad luck in a way for Dustin Poirier, especially. He was the main loser out of that whole situation, because now Dustin Poirier has to fight one of the best fighters on the planet in Max Holloway. I'm going to give Max Holloway his due in this preview and prediction for Holloway and Poirier. Coming right up after this will be my preview and prediction of Gastelum versus Adesanya. Now, Max, Mad Max, as I like to call him, Blessed Holloway, Max Blessed Holloway, has really taken the sport by storm. And to think otherwise would be a gross misrepresentation of your mixed martial arts fandom. This is a guy that lost fights to Conor McGregor, lost fights to Dustin Poirier long ago. And boy, was it long ago. But boy, literally and figuratively, symbolically, however which way you want to look at it, that Max Holloway is in the rearview mirror. That Max Holloway is gone, because this Max Holloway is somebody that is very dangerous. And you go back to Thomas Take Sports podcast episode where I previewed Holloway versus Ortega, which was Max's last fight. Max, I thought, would have a very tough time with Brian Ortega. I thought Brian Ortega was a worthy challenger, was somebody that could quite possibly take the belt from Holloway. And I even believe I still went out on a limb and predicted that Holloway would win, but I didn't think it would be much of an impressive performance. But boy, was I wrong. His last fight, his last performance, was what really led me to believe that, holy moly, this guy is the elite of the elite. He made Ortega fight his fight. He brought Ortega into his quote-unquote world. And it was very entertaining, it was very intriguing, and it was very eye-opening to see a fighter under that spotlight, under that magnitude of a fight in his career, perform at the level that he did. And Brian Ortega was virtually dominated from bell to bell, going blow for blow with Ortega, but not really allowing Ortega the time to really land anything vicious. Max Holloway has this way of pulling you in and then stretching you out. And when he stretches you out, you're within the distance of his punches. And I would compare his style very much to a fighter that most people should know, and that is Nate Diaz. You see a lot of this crisp, pure boxing, punches and bunches, this swarming style that most opponents are not prepared for. As much as they'd like to admit they are prepared for it, they are not prepared for that type of style. Max Holloway is a speed demon inside that cage, and I enjoy watching him fight. He's a fighter that's massively grown on me. He's a fighter that I think has earned the respect of the MMA fan base, whether you love him or hate him. I don't know many people that do hate him. I think he might be one of the most likable guys in the UFC currently. He's a savage, and he's a true old school, new school guy. And that's very marketable for the UFC. That's something that the UFC should really expand on, and they definitely are, by putting him in this fight where he could be a champ of one division, but essentially an interim title champion in another weight class. Very rare instances where this has happened. I don't think this has ever happened where we could quite possibly have a lineal champ and a interim champ inside that UFC brand. Champ, interim champ title, not champ. But essentially what the interim title belt is a number one contender belt. That's what that belt represents. That's what that belt is. It represents the title of you being possibly scheduled to fight the champion. I say possibly because of the reasons that I've somewhat already stated. I don't know if Dana White is going to put Max Holloway in against Habib, or if he's going to put Conor in against Habib right away. I think if Max Holloway beats Dustin Poirier at lightweight, he's got a belt in another division. I think it's time we see somebody else fight Habib. I've already witnessed Conor versus Habib, and I saw what I saw, and I didn't really like what I saw. I didn't really see that as a competitive fight prior to the fight taking place, and it sure as heck wasn't a competitive fight afterwards. The aftermath of that fight led us to believe that the results of a rematch would not be that competitive either. But the people still want to see that fight, and the people pick the fights. So it's a possibility. But I think Max Holloway is a very tough, unique style for Habib Nurmagomedov, one in which he'd be swarming him, he'd be on top of him, throwing punches, but he also has great takedown defense, and Habib has the best takedown offense. So that would be an interesting layer to that matchup. But let's look at this as, what if Dustin Poirier wins this fight? And I hate to look ahead, but with this fight being an interim title fight, you almost have to look ahead. You almost have to look beyond the now. You have to look at what's next. With that interim title, with that 155 division, a lot of things can happen at once. A lot of traffic is in that division. That is what I like to call the Shark Tank of the UFC. So, all that being said, if Dustin Poirier were to win, I would also like to see that fight with Habib Nurmagomedov. Dustin Poirier's fought the best of the best. He's beaten the best of the best. So I'd like to see that fight as well. Poirier not really as well known as Halloway for obvious reasons. He doesn't really have the personality that Halloway has, nor does he have a title belt. The title belt would bring all the exposure and all the attention to Dustin Poirier. But I want to say something really quickly about Dustin Poirier that I don't think people know. And it is that Dustin Poirier, out of the majority of the fighters in the UFC, Dustin Poirier is a phenomenal human being. Does quite a lot for charity. Does quite a lot for other people. And I'm very interested to see how he is pushed or marketed if he were to win this fight, because I think he really deserves a bigger push. He's fought wars inside that UFC octagon. Justin Gaethje and Eddie Alvarez are two wars that come to mind. Fought Eddie Alvarez twice to right a wrong of being illegally kneed, and just destroyed Eddie. Destroyed the notion that he couldn't go toe-to-toe with Justin Gaethje, and boy did he ever. Those are the two wins that really jump out at me, but as well as the fact that he has fought the best of the best, whether he's won or lost. He's 24-5. He's coming off of 3 straight wins, one of which he submitted Anthony Pettis, one of which he TKO'd Justin Gaethje, and the other he TKO'd Eddie Alvarez. His last loss dates back to 2016, which was a knockout loss to Michael Johnson, and Johnson has kind of spiraled downward ever since. So I think that Poirier is a guy that's fought the who's who, and I feel like it's time that title challengers that win big fights should get their title shot. I'm kind of sick of the money fight era. I want to see the best of the best fight each other. I hate immediate rematches unless the first fight was extremely, extremely close. And oftentimes, whether it's just by sheer coincidence or by fighters ducking other fighters, when you have a really close original fight, like John Jones and Alexander Gustafsson won, why was that fight not immediately rebooked? I can give you an answer for that. John Jones did not want any part of Gustafsson at that point. He needed to download the data, fight some fresh meat, get some other wins, and kind of help people forget about that close performance against Alexander Gustafsson. And that's exactly what he did, and that's exactly what happened later on, as Gustafsson was obviously able to win that rematch pretty easily. But in the case of Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway, this is a fight that is a rematch. This is a fight that dates back a long time ago. A fight that is light years away from the usual, from the norm. Prior to, I want to say 2012, let's look up the date, UFC 143, and this fight is taking place at UFC 236. It's almost 100 events later, February 4th, 2012. You got Max Holloway in there with Dustin Poirier. Holloway, at the time, it was, 7 years ago. Holloway, 19 years old. And you had Dustin Poirier in his own right, who was obviously a lot younger, a fighter that was 23 years old. So that is 22, 23. That is a completely different type of fight than what this will be. These fighters are more experienced. These fighters have fought the who's who. And in Max Holloway's case, he's won multiple title fights against Jose Aldo and against Brian Ortega. So this is very different waters. We're going to see two fighters that have really studied each other and have really looked at what one another does well and what one another doesn't do so well. So I expect coming into this fight to have my popcorn ready, to have everything ready in front of me, and to see a true war, a war of all wars. I expect this fight to be bloody. I expect this fight to be one that shows lots and lots of action, one that is epic in every which way. Now let's dive into just the strategy of the fight. Max Holloway, his key is to keep the fight standing. He's at his best when the fight is standing. Dustin Poirier is at his best when the fight is standing. But both of these guys have been through slugfests, and I anticipate that this will be a slugfest. So really, this is going to be a fight that a lot of MMA fans, whether you're a new MMA fan or an older MMA fan, you'll appreciate it. You will appreciate it. You will take it in for what it's worth, and you will see that these guys are the toughest human beings on the face of the earth, the females included, the toughest females on the face of the earth, fighting in the UFC. Round one, if I'm Max Holloway, I'm looking to maybe feel out Dustin Poirier, kind of get his timing, understand where he throws his punches from, where he throws his kicks from, and then second round close in a little bit more, third round close in a little bit more, and then fourth, maybe fifth round, you really start to put the pressure on. And I've seen Dustin Poirier, I don't want to say quit in fights, but I've seen him have a tough time going toe-to-toe, and I did give him the props that he deserves for his performance against Justin Gaethje. That was ultimately a winning performance, but that was very, very close to being a losing performance due to the fact that fight was so back and forth and it was so action-packed. That fight was very tough for Justin Gaethje. Reeling after that fight, he was very down on himself after that fight, because really, had Justin Gaethje used his Division I wrestling capability against Poirier, I think he could have easily won that fight. So, as much as I'd like to give credit for Poirier winning that fight and fighting his fight, can't take anything away from him if Justin Gaethje didn't fight his way. But I thought Poirier probably should have lost that one, just based on the direction it was heading, but Gaethje kind of stayed in the pocket a little bit too long, and Dustin Poirier kind of reacted to that, where I think Max Holloway is a different type of striker than Justin Gaethje. And if you see what I'm doing here, I'm doing a little bit of MMA math, looking at previous opponents and Justin Gaethje's style compared to Max Holloway. Holloway is a far better boxer. Not taking anything away from Justin Gaethje. He's a phenomenal striker, kickboxer as well. But Max Holloway's speed, the fluidity of his punches and kicks, he's somebody that is the elite of the elite. You can't take that away from him, and that's why he's won that title. That's why he's got that title belt wrapped around his waist. As I mentioned, Brian Ortega, I really thought Brian Ortega would be a stiff challenge for Max Holloway. He was not at all. That really opened my eyes as to the type of ability that Max Holloway has inside that UFC cage. If I were a betting man, I would go out on a limb here and say that Max Holloway will win this fight. And I don't think it will be tough. I don't think it will be easy. I think this will be a fight that will go into the third, fourth, maybe even fifth round. Maybe it'll even go to a decision. And if it does, who the hell knows what these incompetent judges will say about this fight. But nonetheless, I'm really excited for this fight. I think this fight has massive, massive implications as far as what's next for a lot of other fighters in the division, namely Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor. If Max Holloway can pull this off, I would put him in my top 3 pound for pound on the planet right now. I think I already have him as such, but I think this would be a foregone conclusion and a formality that he would be in my pound for pound list, especially coming off a win over Dustin Poirier. I think Poirier has a lot of intangibles that could help him win this fight. His leg kicks are nasty. His clinch game is nasty. A key game plan for Poirier would be to clinch Max Holloway. Stay out of his range. Don't let him fight long. Stay on him, pressure him, and wear him down. That's essentially what Poirier did in the first fight. You can download UFC Fight Pass. You can get UFC Fight Pass. You can watch that fight. It was very compelling. It was very back and forth. And for both fighters to be 20 and 23 respectively, and to be able to put that good of a performance on at that age, I can only wonder how great of a performance they are going to be putting on for the fans here on Saturday night in Atlanta, Georgia. Some interesting fights coming up as well, but I think this is one that stands few and far between. I think we could see this fight again, potentially, as a third fight, depending on how things pan out in the future. But you have an opportunity here to really witness a special fight. If people want to see a stand-up war, I think they're going to get a stand-up war in this fight. I'm very pumped. I'm very excited. The real question is, if Max Holloway were to win this fight, would he go back down to featherweight? I think he's done at featherweight. I think he should be done at featherweight, regardless of a win or a loss against Poirier. But the UFC is doing their due diligence and letting him kind of pick. I think if Holloway wins, he vacates. If he loses, he could very well go back down. But he has weight cut quite a bit, and he has taken a lot of damage at 145 in those fights with his oxygen completely depleted. I think we're going to see a much better Max Holloway at the weight class that is made for him. Quite frankly, Holloway could probably fight at welterweight and get away with it as well. He's a massive, massive man. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I got Max Holloway winning versus Dustin Poirier on Saturday night, UFC 236, live on pay-per-view on ESPN+, 10 in the East, 7 in the West, from Atlanta, Georgia. Take care, everybody. Tune in to the pay-per-view and let me know what you think. Feel free to comment in the comment section below on the podcast as I post to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Take care, everybody.